All right, guys, I am here with Ariana Witkin, who is a pediatrician and a good friend of mine, and also the founder of Ariana Witkin Postpartum Coaching and Consulting. And I wanted to have her on to talk about COVID and little kids. So, Ariana, what do we know about COVID and young kids right now?
So the short answer, Hee, is not much. I'm going to talk about a few studies and what we do know, but it's not a ton. So one of the early studies looking at COVID in kids was actually done in China towards the beginning of the pandemic. And it showed that in general, kids are less severely affected than adults, but that younger kids, so babies, our newborns, our infants, are more likely to have severe symptoms and worse disease outcomes than older children, so like teenagers, for example. In terms of some more recent data and studies, so according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, as of about a week ago, like January 21st or so, there were about 2.5 million kids who have tested positive for COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. So that's a lot of kids, right? About 2.5 million. But it represents only about 13% of all cases of COVID in this country, right? So I think it's important to look at it in that context. It's a large number of kids, but relative to the total number of cases, kids actually seem far less likely to develop COVID than adults, which I think is very reassuring. The data, again, that we do have shows that COVID-19 associated hospitalizations is rare, right? So kids, even if they are getting COVID, are not going to the hospital. Also, the death rate amongst kids in COVID is also very low. This is not something that we are really seeing. So with that and what we know now, it appears that severe disease, severe illness from COVID is very rare among children. One last study I just wanted to touch on was a recent study in North Carolina that was just published in Pediatrics on COVID-19 in schools. And it found actually that COVID is rarely transmitted in schools when safety measures are in place. So wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands. I think this is really encouraging that we can protect kids from COVID even when getting them back in school. And I think that's really important for parents of babies that have older children to understand, right? I know I get asked a lot from parents that have an older kid, is it safe to send them back to school with a newborn at home? And I think that this study is reassuring to me that that is likely something that is safe. We definitely need more research and more data, especially about long-term impacts of COVID in kids.
So that was my next question is what do we know about long-term impacts when it comes to children?
Yeah, so there is something called MIS-C or multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or again, MIS-C, and that's known to be associated with COVID-19. We don't know a ton about it, but we do know right now that it's a condition where different parts of the body or different organs become inflamed. So it can affect the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the brain, etc. We don't really know what causes it, but we do know that kids that have developed MIS-C have had COVID-19 or have been around someone. They've had a close contact that's had COVID-19. So again, we're still really learning about what this is, how it affects kids. We don't know why some kids who have COVID get MIS-C and some kids who have COVID don't get MIS-C. We don't know if there are certain pre-existing conditions that make it more likely for a child to get this kind of more severe long-term effect. But that research is ongoing now. And in terms of other kind of long-term impacts for kids, again, I think something that's really important to touch on is the long-term psychosocial and emotional impact for kids, which, as you know, right, we've become in this mental health crisis for children because of COVID-19. The amount of mental health diagnoses and kids with suicidality has increased. So we need more research in that area as well.
That is one of the things that I was super worried about at the beginning, and it has played out pretty much as I expected it to, which is really heartbreaking. And it is reassuring to hear that, schools are thought to be safe right now, and that, if we can, we should be sending our kids back to school. Okay, so vaccinations for everybody, but not children. I'm not hearing about kiddos getting vaccinated. What do we know about the vaccine and children?
Yeah, so again, you're not hearing a lot about it because the short answer is we don't really know a lot. So the two vaccines that were currently approved by the FDA under the emergency use authorization were not studied in children. So here's what we do know, right? So there are two vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is about 95% effective. The Moderna vaccine is about 94% effective. They both require 2 doses. The Pfizer vaccine, the doses are 3 weeks apart. The Moderna vaccines are about 4 weeks apart, right? I think it's important, again, to understand that these trials looked at adults. And they also looked at symptomatic infection over a 2-month follow-up period, right? So we don't really know anything about asymptomatic infection or carrier potential. So can people who have had the vaccine, like myself, right? Can I still be infected with COVID and just not have symptoms? We don't know. Can I still carry COVID and not have symptoms and pass it on to my baby? Maybe, right? We don't know. So I think that's important to talk about as well. The other thing that they didn't study was the duration of protection. So how long does immunity last? Again, these trials really followed people for about 2 months. So we're not sure how long it lasts. Both of the vaccines are mRNA vaccines, which we can talk more about if you want. But basically it means there's no chance of infection. There's also no adjuvant in the vaccine, which I think is important to point out. A lot of vaccines have adjuvants, which is basically just something that's added to some vaccines to enhance the immune response. Neither of the COVID vaccines have adjuvants, which I know is important to people. So I think when thinking about kids and the vaccine, right, it's important to also think about, could kids or could infants, could breastfeeding babies be protected via passive immunity, right? So if me, right, I am a breastfeeding mom who has had the vaccine, can I protect my baby through my breast milk? And again, we don't know. We don't have research on that to show definitively yes or no. Those studies are ongoing. But for me, that's a really, really exciting possibility. And I think it's very possible. So I think, these are all important things to think about. It's important to remember, even with the vaccine, you still need to socially distance, still need to wear a mask, still need to wash your hands. If you are able to get vaccinated, I would strongly encourage everyone to register for VSafe, which is a CDC monitoring tool for kind of large scale public health interventions like vaccination. It's through that program that we're really going to learn more about COVID in the COVID vaccine in kids through mothers who are breastfeeding, through women who are pregnant. So super, super important.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing all that information. Okay, you mentioned the mRNA part of it. Parents are a little concerned about injecting something that sounds very scary like mRNA. Can you step us through if we should be concerned about anything with the mRNA with our little ones, and what does that actually mean?
Yeah, no, totally. I hear you. That's a great question. So both vaccines, again, are mRNA vaccines. And what that really means is that there's no live virus in the vaccine. So there's different ways that vaccines are made. Some use live virus particles. This one has no live virus. So there's no COVID in the vaccine. And the vaccine, mRNA, does not enter your DNA. So it can't cause any genetic changes. And I know for me and for other people, there's been a concern, well, mRNA, that sounds fairly new. There are no other vaccines that have this technology. But actually, mRNA vaccine technology has been being studied for over a decade for potentially other uses with other viruses. So it's actually really not a new technology. It's been around for quite a while, which is one of the reasons why the trials were able to ramp up and happen so quickly. I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining what mRNA is, as you said, just to get a better understanding. So mRNA is like instructions for your cell. Like that's how I like to think of it. In this case, what the mRNA is telling your cells to do is make something called a spike protein, which is something that's just unique to COVID-19, a spike protein for the virus. And eventually down the line, after a cascade of events, what that does is it stimulates your immune system to produce antibodies or virus fighting cells that are specific to COVID-19. So with that mechanism, the mRNA causing the spike protein to kind of trick your body into thinking that you've had an infection and make these virus fighting cells, there's not thought to be any risk to babies who are breastfeeding, right? Because as I said, it can't cause any genetic changes. It doesn't get into your DNA.
That's fascinating. I think a lot of parents will probably find a lot of reassurance in that because mRNA sounds very scary, especially if you hold this belief that it might be able to change your DNA. That's especially frightening. One thing you touched on was how fast these trials did get through because we needed emergency authorization. Is there anything we should be concerned about, with how fast the trials were done and completed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really don't think so. Again, the vaccine, I don't consider the technology to be rushed because it's based on research that's been done for over 10 years, right? So the COVID vaccine can't give you COVID. It can't give COVID to your baby. Again, it's this mRNA that doesn't contain any live virus. So I actually really don't have any concerns about the speed at which the trials were done.
Sure. And I think there's a difference too between a side effect and an expected immune response, right? And so a lot of people, so I actually learned this from Dr. Emily Seidler, who is a fertility specialist here in Boston, but she talks about our language matters when it comes to side effects and expected immune response. So you guys just know that when you get the vaccine, you are supposed to have an immune response. We want that your body, responds to the injection and the vaccine to let us know that your immune response is active and well and able to respond to things that shouldn't be there. Okay, so my last question is vaccines in children. When should we expect this? Do we have any sort of timeline on when our kiddos might be up for vaccination?
Yeah, so I think probably not for a long time. It's really hard to do studies in kids, right? For obvious reasons. We all want to protect them from any potential adverse outcome from any harm. So we're very careful about studies that we do in children, right? For good reason. There are going to be studies in kids happening now, actually, for children who are older. So for both the approved vaccines that I talked about, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccines, they are currently doing studies with kids, I think as young as age 12, actually. So depending on how that study goes, I do think there could potentially be a vaccine available for older kiddos by like the end of the year, like by end of 2021. I don't think there will be a vaccine available for younger children for much longer than that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. All right. Ariana, thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Perfect. That was great.